My name is Brooke Merritt, and I am 35 years old. Just 6 days after we laid my mother to rest, my own brother did the unthinkable. He changed the locks on the house I grew up in, throwing my young daughter's belongings onto the porch in the freezing rain. I can still see my daughter Nora's sneakers soaked through with icy water, her favorite stuffed rabbit lying face down in a muddy puddle. My brother Garrett stood right there in the entryway, our father's doorway, the entrance to a home that has belonged to our family since 1890, and told me straight to my face that I was absolutely nothing. He said, "The land stays with the Merritt's son, that girls marry out." But there was one final section to that will he never saw coming. If a family has ever made you feel like the spare child, the one they forgot to count, you and I know how deep that scar goes. When the lawyer read that final clause out loud, announcing my true net worth to a room full of relatives who had spent my entire life calling me a leftover, my brother literally hit the floor. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, the channel where quiet people finally get the last word and the paperwork does the shouting. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from, and be sure to subscribe. Now, let me take you back to Marietta, Ohio, a town of 8,000 where the Merritt name used to mean something. People there know your grandfather's name and which church pew you sit in. Our family helped build half the houses on Front Street. My great-grandfather started Merritt & Son Woodworks back in 1947, and the hand-carved walnut sign still hangs proudly on 3rd Street. My father, Tom Merritt, ran that shop for 31 years. He was incredibly skilled with his hands, but absolutely terrible with his daughters. I say daughters, but there was only one, just me. And then there was Garrett, 6 years older, the golden firstborn son whose name actually fit the sign. Growing up, our roles were split. Garrett went to the workshop after school while I was sent to the kitchen with my mother, Ruth. He learned to joint boards, and I learned to keep quiet. Every single Thanksgiving, every tax season, my father repeated his favorite rule like a holy prayer. The land stays with the Merritt son, girls marry out. He said it so calmly, like stating the sun rises in the east, not with cruelty, just as an absolute fact of life. My mother would just press her lips together and pass the potatoes, while I stared at my plate. When I was 15, I asked him if I could work in the shop on Saturdays. He looked at me like I was crazy. He said I was not staying anyway. I left town at 18 with a duffel bag and a flat carpenter's pencil he gave me when I was 9. He had tucked it behind my ear once, saying I looked like a Merritt. It was the only time he ever said that. I put myself through an accounting degree at Ohio State, then earned a master's in forensic accounting. I loved the thrill of following money through tangled webs of shell companies and fake invoices to find the person who thought they were smarter than a spreadsheet. I was damn good at it. By 26, I was at a firm in Columbus, dismantling fraud cases that made the evening news. At 29, I started my own firm, Merritt Forensic Group. It grew from 3 employees to 22. I built that business entirely alone in a rented office on High Street. My brother sneered and called it a calculator job, while my father dismissed it as something to occupy my time until I settled down. Back home in Marietta, nobody knew what forensic accounting actually was, and honestly, nobody cared to find out. During family dinners, whenever Garrett bragged about shop expansions or flipping houses, my father would lean in, hanging on his every word. But if I mentioned wrapping up a 7-figure fraud investigation for a Fortune 500 client, my father would just mutter that it was nice and ask me to pass the rolls. So, I stopped talking about my success. I kept my mouth shut and carried my old carpenter's pencil in my bag. a simple piece of cedar that still smelled of sawdust. I kept it to remind myself of who I was and how quietly I had built my own legacy as a true merit. By the time I sold a majority stake in my firm in 2023, my net worth was well over $5 million. My family assumed I lived in a modest apartment and drove a basic Honda because I was struggling. In truth, I just liked keeping things simple, but nobody ever bothered to ask. Then, 14 months ago, my father died of a sudden heart attack while working at his shop. He was running a piece of white oak through the planer when his heart simply stopped. I got the call at my desk in Columbus, and my business partner had to drive me to Marietta because my hands were shaking too hard to steer. When I walked in, Garrett was already playing the grieving air, shaking hands in the living room. Garrett had put on a nice blazer, looking like a man who had been rehearsing for this moment his entire life. Meanwhile, I quietly handled everything else: the funeral home, the death certificates, the insurance phone calls, and the church bulletins. My mother was too hollowed out by grief to function, and my brother was too busy playing the grieving son in public to actually do any real work. I did not complain, though. That is my flaw. I see a burden, and I carry it myself because nobody ever taught me it was safe to put things down. But after the funeral, I noticed my mother had a private meeting with Raymond Voss, our family estate attorney. She went to his office on 3rd Street, completely alone. When my mother returned from that meeting, she was quieter than usual, but she also seemed steadier, like someone who had finally made a major decision. When I asked if everything was all right, she just patted my hand and told me that my father's affairs were complicated, but that Voss was sorting it all out. I did not push. I had my daughter Nora to care for, a firm to run, and the mother who seemed determined to handle this one thing on her own. 6 weeks ago, she had a massive stroke while weeding the garden she had kept since I was born. A neighbor found her lying in the marigolds, and she passed away at the hospital 3 hours later. I was on the road within 20 minutes of receiving the call. My 7-year-old daughter Nora sat in the back seat, quietly watching the Ohio farmland blur past the window. Children can always sense when a tragedy is simply too heavy for words. The funeral was held at First Congregational, the very church where 4 generations of our family had been baptized and buried. Over 100 people attended, and Garrett delivered the eulogy. He stood at the pulpit in an expensive charcoal suit, speaking for 12 long minutes about carrying the family name and running the shop. He talked about being the dutiful son, but he completely ignored how our mother had spent her last 14 months entirely alone in that giant house. And he never mentioned me once. After the service, Aunt Carol pulled me aside in the fellowship hall and whispered how proud my father would have been of Garrett. I wanted to laugh, but I held it in. While helping Nora with her jacket by the coat rack, Raymond Voss, our 66-year-old estate lawyer, approached me. He was always dry as chalk dust, carefully measuring his words. He told me to stay in town, revealing that my father had quietly changed the will after Garrett got into some financial trouble. Voss said we both needed to hear the changes together, then slipped away. Just 6 days later, my brother called while I was in my late mother's kitchen, preparing breakfast for my little girl. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, flat and golden, casting light on the dust drifting above the old counter. Suddenly, Garrett's voice cut through the quiet. He demanded I move out by Friday, with absolutely no warning or concern for my well-being. He claimed the house was his, stating that our father had made that clear for 30 years, and that probate was just a silly formality. He wanted my daughter and me gone immediately, so he and his partner could start home renovations. He even referred to my daughter as the kid. When I reminded him we had not even read the will, he scoffed and said the land stays with the son. I gripped the kitchen counter in absolute fury. My daughter, Nora, sat at the kitchen table, her spoon frozen halfway to her mouth, her wide eyes locked onto me. I gripped the phone and told Garrett I wasn't leaving until Voss read our father's will. Garrett didn't even hesitate. He told me I'd leave with nothing, and then he delivered a line he must have rehearsed for years. He said, "Hope you enjoy being homeless, Brooke. I made sure you get nothing." The line went dead. I set the phone down, finished making the oatmeal, and sat down across from my little girl. I forced myself to eat. When someone tries to take the ground out from under you, you plant your feet and eat your breakfast. But that evening, when I tried my key in the front door, it wouldn't even budge. The locks had already been changed. The brass key on its cracked leather fob, the one my father gave me at 18, saying, "For when you come home," turned in the cylinder and caught dead. The boxes were on the porch when I walked around back. 3 cheap cardboard moving boxes from Pike Street. Nora's clothes, my suitcase, and my mother Ruth's recipe tin with her handwritten cards going back 40 years. All of it sat in half an inch of rainwater on the wooden planks where my mother used to drink her morning coffee. Sloane opened the front door, wearing a cream cashmere wrap and holding a glass of Sancerre. She looked at me like I was a courier who showed up at the wrong address. "You're still here," Sloane said. I stared past her. "Where's Nora's room? Where are her books?" Sloane sighed. "Garrett packed everything of yours. This isn't really her home, Brooke. She's visited, 4 times?" She said it as if a 7-year-old needed to earn her place in her grandmother's house. Right then, I felt something lock into position behind my ribs. Not anger, but clarity. I loaded the boxes, buckled Nora into her seat, and walked back to the porch where Sloane was watching me like a show. "You can keep the locks," I told her. "You can keep every room in this house. But you will not speak about my daughter again. Not to me, not to Garrett, and not to anyone in this town." "That's not a request," I said. Sloane's smile thinned and she shut the door. I got in the car. Nora was holding her damp, stuffed rabbit against her chest. "Where are we going, Mom?" she asked. I didn't have an answer, so I just drove. We ended up at the Riverview Motel on Route 7, a mile outside of town, for $49 a night. It had 2 double beds, a microwave, and a window looking out at the parking lot. Nora thought it was an adventure. She bounced on the bed, asking for pizza. I said yes because saying anything else would make my voice crack. I sat on the other bed and stared at my phone. I had a good life and a condo in Columbus. I could easily drive 2 hours west and never set foot in Marietta again. Let Garrett have the house. Let him keep the sign, the shop, and the whole crumbling kingdom. I didn't need it. I had built my own life. But Voss had told me to stay, saying my father made changes. And my mother, Ruth, had met with Voss alone after the first funeral, returning like a woman who had finally set down a heavy burden she had carried for decades. I owed it to her to hear what this was. Besides, Marietta was the only place Nora knew her grandparents. The backyard with the marigolds, the river path where my dad took me fishing on Saturday mornings before he decided I wasn't worth his time, and the 18 acres behind the property where the old boathouse sat under a canopy of sycamores. Nora loved that land. She called it the river place. I stayed not to fight, but because Voss asked me to, because my mother would have wanted it, and because my daughter deserved to know this town before the Merritt name only counted if you were born male. Raymond Voss's office was on the 2nd floor of a limestone building on 3rd Street, 3 doors down from the shop. The stairwell smelled of old paper and lemon oil. His desk was walnut, built by my grandfather. The bookshelves behind him held 40 years of Ohio Revised Code and a framed photo of him shaking hands with my father at a Rotary dinner in the 90s. "Sit down, Brooke," he said, gesturing to the leather chair across from him. He didn't do small talk, and I liked that about him. "The formal reading is next Thursday," he said. "Both you and Garrett are required to be present." He emphasized that word. "Your father's will has a provision that can only be administered with both children in attendance. I'm the executor. Those are the terms." I leaned forward. "Voss, what did my father change?" He folded his hands on the desk, choosing his words carefully. "After your brother's business difficulties, and after your father co-signed certain obligations and restructured certain debts, Tom revised a section of his will. He added a condition to the disposition of a specific asset." I held my breath. "Which asset?" "The back acres," Voss said. "The 18 acres along the river, including the boathouse." My chest tightened. "What kind of condition?" I asked. "The kind that requires both beneficiaries to submit a verified financial statement. Your father wanted proof that whoever receives that land can hold it without mortgaging it or losing it to creditors." He paused. "Your father learned something, Brooke. Late, but he did." "What did he learn?" Voss tapped a heavy silver pen on his desk. "That the loudest person in the room isn't always the one you should trust with the keys." He stood. "Thursday, 10 a.m. Bring documentation. Bring Garrett." My brother and Sloan moved into the family house within 48 hours. By the weekend, they had ripped out my mother's kitchen cabinets, the ones my grandfather had built with solid maple and dovetail joints. They replaced them with cheap flat-pack things from a catalog. Sloan posted photos to Instagram with the caption, "New chapter, honoring the legacy by making it ours." 72 likes. On Monday, I drove past the shop and saw a sign on the window. "Estate sale, tools and equipment, everything must go." My father's tools, his draw knives and hand planes, representing 30 years of carefully maintained steel, were being sold off like junk. I parked across the street and sat there for 10 minutes with the engine running, watching strangers walk out carrying his chisels in plastic bags. I almost drove away, but then I saw it shoved against the back wall behind some scrap lumber. My father's toolbox, the old green metal one with the dented lid and brass latch. The will specifically left it to me. Personal hand tools and toolbox to Brooke. It was the only thing my name was attached to. I walked in. Garrett was at the counter counting cash. He looked up and said, "You're not welcome here." I looked at him. "That toolbox is mine. Dad's will lists it." He stared at me for a long beat, then shrugged. "Take it. It's junk anyway, just like everything else he left you." The toolbox was heavier than I expected. I carried it to my car with both arms and set it in the trunk next to Nora's car seat. As I put it down, something heavy shifted inside. I heard a metallic scrape, like an object sliding against the tin lining. I didn't open it yet, but I wish I had. I want to pause here because I know some of you have held a box like this, the only thing a parent left you while someone else took the house. If that's you, tell me in the comments what was in your box. A ring? A Bible? Or measuring cups? I want to hear it. And if this story is landing, please subscribe so the algorithm stops burying it. Okay, back to that toolbox and the woman who showed up at my motel room 3 days later. Aunt Carol arrived at the Riverview Motel on a Wednesday evening, unannounced, with some potato soup and an agenda. She was 63, my mother's younger sister, a retired school secretary who had lived in Belpre her whole life. She wore a fleece vest, orthopedic shoes, and an expression trying hard to look sympathetic. "I heard about the house," she said, sitting on the edge of the bed like she owned the room. Nora was doing her homework at the little desk. Carol glanced at her once, then turned back to me. "Brooke, honey, I know this feels unfair, but you need to understand. This is how it's always been. Your father's father did the same thing. My father did the same thing. Boys keep the land. Girls marry out." There it was, the family catechism straight from the book of Tom Merritt. "Carol, I'm not married," I said. "I have a 7-year-old daughter sleeping in a motel room because my brother threw our things in the rain." "And that's terrible," Carol sighed. "It is, but fighting it will only make things worse." She leaned forward, her face lined with a lifetime of quiet compromise. "I gave up my share of your grandfather's farm, 40 acres, she told me. I signed it over to my brother because that is what was expected of me. And you know what? I survived. You will too." She said it so casually, as if survival was the absolute ceiling of what a woman should hope for. Like our highest ambition should be to endure having everything stolen from us with quiet grace. I looked her in the eyes and asked, "Did you want those 40 acres, Carol?" She blinked, and for a split second something raw and honest flickered across her face, a flash of old anger and loss that she had buried deep. "It does not matter what I wanted," she whispered. "It matters what works." Then she left, leaving me in that motel room with a cold bowl of soup and her bitter advice. Aunt Carol was not just keeping the system alive. She was its oldest casualty. The next morning, I sat at the rickety motel desk, brewed a pot of terrible coffee, and tried to lose myself in work. I was Brooke Merritt, certified public accountant and certified fraud examiner. I founded a forensic accounting firm that billed $14 million last year. While my daughter Nora watched cartoons on the bed, I focused on a fraud case from Akron. Numbers have always been my anchor. They do not play favorites, and they do not care if you are a son or a daughter. At noon, I called Gwen Avery, my partner at the firm. I had sold my majority stake to her, but I still held a massive equity position and an active advisory role. "How is small-town life treating you?" Gwen asked when she answered. I laughed dryly, telling her my brother had already sold my father's tools, and my aunt had delivered some potato soup with a lecture about knowing my place. "Do they still think you are just a bookkeeper?" she asked. I told her they thought I was a bookkeeper who could not even afford her own apartment. Gwen was silent for a moment before asking, "Brooke, do they have any idea what you are actually worth?" I looked out the window at my old sedan. Nobody here had ever seen my portfolio. They never asked, and I never told them. It was a mix of pride and the lingering sting of them calling my career a silly little hobby. You might wonder why I stayed quiet, but the truth is simple. I did not want to prove my value to people who decided I had none before I was even old enough to talk. Gwen sighed. "Fair enough. But if there is a reading and something is at stake, you might have to show those numbers whether you want to or not." 2 days before the will reading, I drove past my childhood home on Maple Lane to check on the garden. It was an old habit, but seeing the dying, unwatered marigolds broke my heart. What really made me stop, though, was a man in his mid-40s standing on the front porch. He wore a polo shirt with a bank logo, confronting my brother Garrett through the screen door. Garrett's voice sounded tight, defensive, and desperate. "The estate will cover it," he pleaded. "Once probate clears, I will have access to everything," Garrett told him. "You will get your payment." The banker shook his head. "Mr. Merritt, this notice is the third we have sent. The balance on the second mortgage is past due." Garrett snapped back, insisting the estate would handle it. But then he spotted my car parked at the curb. His face twisted from sheer panic to raw fury. He slammed the door, and the banker retreated to his sedan. I just sat there, realizing my brother had a secret second mortgage on the house he had kicked me out of. It reminded me of something my father used to say. A man who borrows against his foundation is a man standing on a trapdoor. I had always assumed my father was talking about the machine shop, about the importance of keeping the family business debt-free. But sitting in my car, watching that banker's sedan disappear down the street, I began to wonder if he had actually been talking about Garrett all along. I drove back to my motel room. I did not open the green toolbox that night either. Something deep down told me to wait until I was truly ready for whatever was waiting inside. But my excuses were running thin. The night before the reading, I finally placed the green metal box on the bed while my daughter slept. The room was silent except for the hum of the mini fridge as I unlatched the brass clasp. Inside was a coping saw, a small block plane, and a set of marking gauges. Beneath them, tucked against the tin lining, were 3 items that changed everything. First was a carpenter's pencil. On its flat side, scratched in my father's cramped handwriting, were the letters T-M-B-B-M, with an arrow pointing from his initials to mine. It felt like a transfer. The second was a brass key, smaller and older than the house key. I turned it over and saw a metal tag wired to it, the kind used for storage lockers. Stamped into the metal were the words, "Boathouse, Back Acres." It was not the key to the main house. It was the key to the 18 acres along the river where we used to fish. This key belonged to the river place where my father used to take me fishing. The third item was a folded document. I unfolded it, my hands surprisingly steady. It was a lien notice from First Federal Savings showing a second mortgage on the family house for $340,000, dated 3 years ago. My father's signature was at the bottom, and in the margin he had penciled 7 words. "Brooke, ask Voss about the back acres." I read those words twice, my heart pounding. At 11 p.m., I dialed our family lawyer, Voss. He answered on the second ring, as if he had been sitting by the phone waiting for my call. "You found the lien notice?" he said, and it was not a question. $340,000 on the house, I said. Voss sighed. "Your father took that second mortgage 3 years ago to cover your brother's debts. Garrett's real estate venture collapsed. He overextended on 2 properties, borrowed from predatory private lenders, and was facing personal bankruptcy. Your father co-signed the loans, then refinanced the house to consolidate it all." I sat on the bed, pressing the phone to my ear as the truth washed over me. "So, the house Garrett just kicked me out of is heavily leveraged. The equity is basically gone." Voss confirmed it, adding that even the shop had a $40,000 lien from a supplier Garrett never paid. "Between the house and the shop, your brother is inheriting about $380,000 in secured debt against maybe $400,000 in actual value," Voss explained. "He is inheriting a break-even property at best." I looked at the paper in my hand, staring at my father's messy handwriting about the back acres. Voss continued. "The 18 acres along the river are completely debt-free, appraised at $1.1 million. Your father knew Garrett would ruin it, so he added a condition. Both of you must submit financial statements, and the land goes to whichever child can prove they can hold it debt-free." Now, you and I can see exactly what my father was doing. Dead hand control, I said, recognizing the legal term from my own years of reviewing estate fraud. Voss confirmed it. Exactly. It is completely enforceable. Your father learned his lesson the hard way, Brooke, but he learned it. I hung up the phone and sat there in the dim light, holding the old brass key in one hand and the pencil in the other. The next morning, Voss called both of us to lay out the rules. I could hear Garrett screaming through the receiver even though we were on separate lines. A financial statement? Fine. I have nothing to hide. But he did have something to hide. He had $380,000 of debt to hide. Garrett had spent his entire life believing that confidence was the same thing as competence. He submitted his paperwork by noon, then called me, practically gloating. Just so you know, I already turned in my statement. The land will be mine by sundown tomorrow. I stayed here, I ran the shop, and I carried the family name. A piece of paper is not going to change 30 years of Dad telling this town who his heir was. Bring your little pay stub, Brooke, or your W-2, or whatever you calculator people file. It does not matter. I just listened to him brag. Okay, I said. He demanded to know if that was all I had to say. What would you like me to say, Garrett? I asked, and was met with silence. I want you to admit the land was always supposed to be mine. My brother Garrett's cold voice buzzed through the phone. That's how this family works. I looked at my daughter Nora, quietly drawing a green crayon river at the motel desk. I understand exactly how this family works, I said, hanging up. I dialed Gwen immediately. I need a verified financial statement by 5 p.m. today. Full portfolio, certified public accountant certified, net worth summary on the front page. Gwen gasped. You are doing this? I am doing the last thing my father ever asked of me, I replied. That night, after Nora slept, I sat in the motel parking lot, engine off, windows down. The Ohio River was half a mile away, but in the still night, its low, heavy rush filled the silence. It was a low, constant sound, like the breath of this town. I did not need those 18 acres. I had my own money. I had a career. I had a healthy, smart daughter who would be fine whether we lived in Columbus or on the moon. The rational part of my brain, the forensic accountant part that ran cost-benefit analyses for a living, told me to walk away. It said to let Garrett have the land, let him mortgage it, lose it, and watch it get auctioned off. None of that was my problem. But another part of me remembered Saturday mornings on the riverbank, my father showing me how to tie a clinch knot, the gold sycamores in October, and the sound of the boathouse door on its rusted hinges. That part of me simply refused to let go. My father had carved my initials on a pencil. He'd hidden a boathouse key inside the old toolbox he left me. He'd scribbled, "Ask Voss," on an old lien notice, tucking it where only I would find it. Those weren't accidents. They were instructions from a man who spent his life believing the wrong things and realized it too late. I texted Gwen, "Send the statement to Voss." She replied in under a minute, "Already done. $5.83 million, certified by Kowalski and Associates, independent certified public accountants. You are on record." I looked at the river. I wasn't doing this to beat Garrett. I was doing the last thing my father ever asked of me. If that also proved my dad wrong about what daughters are capable of, well, numbers do not lie. On the morning of the reading, Sloane showed up at my motel room door at 7 a.m. She was dressed like she was going to brunch, silk blouse, linen trousers, and a Tory Burch tote that cost more than my monthly motel bill. She held a manila envelope. "Can we talk?" she said, leaning against the door frame with a forced, warm smile. "Woman to woman?" I let her in because I wanted to hear what she would say. Nora was brushing her teeth in the bathroom. Sloane sat on the edge of my bed and opened the envelope. "This is a quitclaim deed," she said, sliding it across the comforter. "Garrett asked me to bring it. If you sign this, releasing any claim to the estate, the house, and the land, Garrett will give you $15,000 and all of Ruth's personal photos." I looked at the document. 4 pages, crisp, printed, and already notarized on Garrett's side. He'd planned this, hiring a lawyer to prepare it in advance. $15,000, I said, and some photos. "It's generous, Brooke," Sloane said. "Since the will favors Garrett, you'd spend more than that in legal fees trying to contest it. This way, everyone walks away clean. No drama, no hard feelings." "No hard feelings?" I repeated. "Your husband threw my daughter's sneakers into the pouring rain." Sloane's smile didn't waver, but her eyes did. "Garrett can be impulsive, but he means well. He's under a lot of pressure." "I'm sure he is," I said, folding the quitclaim and sliding it back. "I don't sign things under pressure in motel rooms." "If Garrett has an offer, he can present it through Voss," I told her. Sloane stood up, the warmth completely gone from her face. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I'm just making it honest." She left, and I immediately threw the envelope in the trash. Gwen called at 8:30. "Statements delivered to Voss's office, certified, sealed, the whole package. Kowalski signed off personally." "Thank you, Gwen." Her voice shifted. "Careful, Brooke. When they open that in a room full of people who think you're broke, you know what's going to happen, right?" I knew. The forensic accountant in me had already mapped out the reactions. Garrett's utter disbelief, Sloane's sheer panic, and Carol's complete confusion. The numbers on that statement told a story none of them had ever bothered to read. Net worth, $5,830,000. That is $2.4 million from my firm sale, $1.9 million in index holdings, and $1.1 million in real estate. 2 buildings in Columbus I bought and managed myself. Plus $430,000 in retirement and cash. I'd built every dollar of it. No inheritance, no family money, just 17 years of being very good at a career my family called a hobby. "I know what's going to happen," I said. "I'm ready." I looked at Nora, sitting on the bed, braiding her stuffed rabbit's ears with the focused intensity only a 7-year-old can muster. My poor daughter had slept in a cheap motel for 2 weeks simply because her arrogant uncle decided she didn't belong in her own grandmother's house. She had actually overheard Sloane whisper, "This isn't really her home." Nora had packed her own backpack without even being asked, because at 7, she was already learning that being a merit girl meant carrying your own weight. "I'm ready," I said. Gwen replied, "Good. Call me right after it's done. And Brooke, make them say the entire net worth number out loud." I almost smiled. Almost. "Let me ask you, if you were in my shoes right now, what would you do?" Everyone kept telling me to keep the peace and accept my place. But tell me honestly, would you have signed that insulting quitclaim deed? If you're enjoying this, subscribe and tell me in the comments, because the next room I walked into was the one I'd been waiting 17 years to sit in. Voss's office, Thursday at 10 a.m. The conference room smelled heavily of lemon polish and old leather. In the center sat a solid walnut table my grandfather had built. There were 6 chairs around it, a pitcher of water, and 2 folders placed precisely at the head of the table. Garrett arrived first, wearing a charcoal suit, a pocket square, and a Rolex that caught the overhead light. He pulled out a chair and sat like a man waiting to accept an award. Sloane came in next, phone already out. Then Carol arrived, clutching her purse with both hands, wearing her motel fleece. She nodded to me and sat as far from Garrett as possible. I took a seat directly across from my brother. Nora was back at the motel with a reliable sitter, since I decided she didn't need to witness whatever mess this turned out to be. Inside my bag, resting right next to that old carpenter's pencil, I felt the comforting weight of the brass key. As I sat in that quiet room with the pale morning light falling across the walnut table, I suddenly understood something I'd missed for 20 years. The key my father gave me when I was 18, which I carried on a cracked leather fob and tried to fit into the house lock after Garrett changed it, was never a house key. It was too small, and the teeth were all wrong. It was the boathouse key, the key to the riverland. He gave me the 18 acres back then, and I had spent nearly 2 decades completely blind to it. Attorney Voss entered, quietly closed the heavy door, and took his seat at the head of the table. He placed his hands flat on the 2 folders. "We will begin with your father's will," he announced calmly. "Then we will address the final section." Garrett smirked in triumph. I remained perfectly expressionless. Voss opened the first folder and began reading. "Last will and testament of Thomas Edward Merritt, revised 18 months ago, witnessed and notarized in Washington County, Ohio." He went through the standard legal jargon, debts, funeral costs, and executor details, in the flat tone of a man who had done this 1,000 times. Then he reached the distribution. "To my son, Garrett, I leave the residential property at 14 Maple Lane and the commercial business at 312 3rd Street. Garrett leaned back in his chair. He didn't just smile. He did something worse. He nodded slowly, like a smug king confirming what he believed was his birthright. Voss continued reading. "To my daughter, Brooke Ellen Merritt, I leave my personal hand tools and toolbox." That was it. One single dismissive line. 35 years of being Tom Merritt's daughter, suddenly reduced to a rusty green metal box and a set of worn chisels. Carol exhaled softly in pity. Sloane was already typing away on her phone, likely celebrating. Garrett turned his cold gaze toward me. "The land stays with the Merritt son," he said, the words echoing like a bell he'd waited his entire life to strike. "I'm truly sorry it had to be this way, Brooke, but our dad made his final choice." My brother Garrett always made his choice, and as usual, I said nothing. I just sat there, looking at Voss. Our lawyer looked back at me with a tired expression that felt like the ghost of patience. "Mr. Merritt," Voss said to my brother, "we are not finished." Garrett waved a hand. "What is left? She got the toolbox, and I got the house. It is done." But Voss was not moving. "It is not done," he said, closing the first folder and placing his palm on the second. "Your father's will contains one final section, and I am required to read it aloud to both of you before any asset can transfer." Garrett's confidence did not crack. It only hardened as he stood up like he was about to give a toast at his own coronation. "A final section," he scoffed. "Fine, read it." Garrett pointed his finger directly at me. "Let us be clear about what is happening here," he said, raising his voice. "My sister left this family when she was 18. She moved to Columbus to push numbers. She did not run the shop or maintain the property. She did not carry the name. I did. All of that. Every single holiday while she was gone. Every time a pipe burst or Dad needed a cosign on a..." He caught himself stopping mid-sentence. "I stayed," he sneered, "and she left. That is the math." He turned to me, 41 years of pure entitlement shining in his eyes. "Hope you enjoy being homeless, Brooke. I made sure you get nothing." It was the exact same script he used on the phone 6 days ago, spoken in front of witnesses as if repeating it could make it true. Garrett's wife Sloane nodded along like a mindless puppet, while Carol just stared blankly at the table. Voss waited. He waited the way a man waits when he has already read the next page and knows exactly what is coming. When my brother finally sat back down, Voss opened the second folder. "The final section of Thomas Merritt's will," he began, "concerns the disposition of a parcel not included in the homestead grant, specifically 18 acres of unencumbered riverfront land in Washington County, including the boathouse, appraised at $1.1 million. Garrett blinked in confusion. Sloane's phone stopped moving. Even Carol looked up. "This parcel," Voss continued, "is subject to a conditional bequest your father attached, which I must now administer." Voss pulled a single page from the folder. I recognized the paper. Heavy cream stock, the durable kind used for legal instruments meant to last. "I will read your father's words exactly as written," Voss announced, adjusting his glasses. "I, Thomas Edward Merritt, being of sound mind, do hereby direct that the 18-acre riverfront parcel, Washington County parcel number 0411720, including all structures, shall not be distributed as part of the homestead grant. This land has been in our family for 4 generations. I have watched it held, improved, and honored. I have also watched other family assets leveraged and nearly lost. I will not watch this land go the same way." Garrett shifted in his chair. Voss kept reading my father's words. "Therefore, I direct my executor to require each of my children to submit a verified financial statement, prepared and certified by an independent CPA, demonstrating their current net worth and debt obligations. The 18-acre parcel shall pass to whichever child demonstrates the financial capacity to hold this land free and clear without mortgaging it or placing any encumbrance upon it for a minimum period of 10 years. Voss paused. The room was deathly silent, except for the clock ticking on the wall. "If neither child meets this standard, the land shall be sold and the proceeds donated." He looked up at us, reading the final line. "I have spent my life believing that land passes to the son. I was wrong. Land does not go to the loudest. It goes to whoever can actually hold it." That last line felt like a stone dropping into still water, deep inside my chest. My father, the same man who told me at 15 that I had no future here, the man who never once asked about my career, had written those words in a lawyer's office, knowing they would stay on paper forever. Carol made a soft, choking sound. Garrett said nothing at all. Voss set the page down. "Both financial statements have been submitted, and I will now review them." He opened 2 sealed envelopes side by side and began with my brother's. "Garrett Thomas Merritt, verified financial statement prepared by Henderson Accounting, Parkersburg. Total assets: residential property at 14 Maple Lane." Voss read the numbers. "Estimated value, $410,000. Commercial property at 312 3rd Street. Estimated value, $95,000. Personal accounts and vehicle, $11,400. Then came the liabilities. Second mortgage on 14 Maple Lane, balance $298,000. Supplier lien on 3rd Street, $42,000. Personal loans, $87,000. Credit cards, $31,000. The air in the room turned thick. "Net worth," Voss announced in a flat, precise tone, negative $41,600. Garrett's jaw locked, and Sloane gripped his arm. That is temporary, Garrett stammered. The business is recovering. Those debts are being restructured. Garrett tried to argue, claiming he would sell assets once the estate settled. Mr. Merritt, Voss interrupted, his voice quiet but final. The condition requires demonstrated capacity at the time of filing, not optimistic forecasts. Your statement shows insolvency. The house is worth $400,000, but it carries $340,000 in unsecured debt that you co-created and your father absorbed. You did not inherit an asset, Mr. Merritt. You inherited a lien. For the first time since the funeral, Garrett actually looked at me. Not through me, not past me, but directly at me. In my brother's face, I saw something I had never seen before. It was fear, but he was not afraid of me. He was terrified of the numbers, of the cold, merciless arithmetic proving his entire life was built on someone else's money. And now, the balance was due. Read hers, he muttered hoarsely. Read my sister's. Voss picked up the second envelope. Brooke Ellen Merritt, he read. Verified financial statement, prepared by Kowalski and Associates, independent CPA, Columbus, Ohio. As he turned the page, the room grew so quiet I could hear Carol breathing. Voss read my assets evenly, like a weather report. Equity stake in Merritt Forensic Group, post-sale, $2.4 million. Diversified investment portfolio, $1.9 million. Commercial real estate holdings, 2 properties in the Columbus metropolitan area, valued at $1.1 million. Retirement accounts, $280,000, Voss continued. Cash and liquid reserves, $150,000. Sloane let out a strange choking sound, like the wind had been completely knocked out of her. Total liabilities, Voss read, 0. No outstanding debts, no mortgages, no liens of any kind. He placed the paper down on the desk. Net worth, $5,830,000. That final number hit the room like a silent explosion. $5.83 million. Every single penny earned by me and completely mine. Garrett just stared at me, his mouth hanging open, unable to speak a word. Carol gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth, while Sloane sat frozen, her face as pale as old paper. I did not speak, because I did not need to. I simply reached into my bag and let my fingers rest on that old carpenter's pencil, the one marked TM to BM. And I waited. By the terms of your father's conditional bequest, Voss announced, Brooke Merritt is the only qualifying beneficiary. The 18-acre riverfront parcel, including the boathouse, passes directly to Brooke. He looked over at my brother. Mr. Merritt, do you have any questions? Garrett's hands were pressed flat against the table, his fingers splayed as if he were trying to keep himself from spinning off the earth. His face was bloodless. 5, he whispered. 5 million. 5.83, Voss corrected, because Raymond Voss was a man who demanded absolute precision. Right then, my brother's eyes rolled back in his head and he collapsed. He slammed into the chair on his way to the floor, which caused the chair to crash into the table. A glass of water tipped over, spilling and rolling across the polished walnut surface my grandfather had hand-built 60 years ago. Water pooling around the legal folders like a slow, rising tide. Sloane let out a short, sharp scream, born more from sheer shock than grief, and lunged toward him. Carol scrambled up so fast her purse hit the floor, scattering coins across the hardwood. Voss's assistant was already calling for help. "He is breathing," she said, kneeling beside him with 2 fingers on his wrist. "Pulse is rapid but steady." I just sat quietly in my chair. I did not move. I did not gloat. I did not feel a single drop of triumph as I watched Garrett collapse onto the floor. You might expect me to feel some joy, seeing the man who threw my daughter's shoes into the rain finally fall. But I just felt empty. I felt the bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who spent 35 years being underestimated. Sloane was fanning him with a folder, while Carol stood frozen against the wall, her hands pressed to her cheeks. Voss just sat at the head of the table, waiting with cold patience. I reached into my bag and pulled out the old brass key on its cracked leather fob. I set it on the table next to the spilled water, next to the folders, next to the wreckage of my brother's pride. It was the key my father gave me at 18. The day I originally left this place, my father had handed me that key and said, "This is for when you come home." Well, I had finally come home, and the land was coming with me. The paramedics arrived in exactly 11 minutes. By then, Garrett was sitting upright in a chair with a cold compress pressed against his forehead. Sloane hovered right beside him, looking like a guilty bodyguard who had been caught sleeping on the job. The emergency medical technicians checked his blood pressure, shone a pen light in his eyes, and told him he needed to see a doctor immediately. He refused to go. Of course he did, because merit men do not ride in ambulances. Once they left, Garrett stared at me across the table with a look I had never seen on his face. It was raw and crumbling. "You knew," he stammered, his voice shaking. "You sat there, and you knew." I looked back at him calmly. I knew I had built a successful career. I knew I had earned every single dollar of my own money. But I did not know any of it would matter in this room until about a week ago. He accused me of hiding it, of letting him look like a total fool. I told him straight to his face that he looked like whatever he chose to look like, and that I had not made a single decision for him. His jaw trembled, and then the self-pity arrived right on schedule. He whined about staying behind, running the shop, and giving up everything for this family while I was sitting on $6 million. He complained that the land was going to someone who would not lose it. "That was not me. That was Carol," a voice said. "I gave up 40 acres, Carol said, her voice thin and fragile. "I gave them to my brother because that was the rule. Boys keep the land. And it ate my life, Garrett. That rule completely ate my whole life." She wiped her wet face with the back of her hand, admitting our fathers were wrong, and that she was wrong for telling me to just accept it. She looked at me and apologized. I believe she truly meant it, but meaning well and actually doing something are 2 very different things, and she knew that just as well as I did. 3 months later, the truth of his financial ruin caught up with him. The house on Maple Lane went into foreclosure because Garrett could not cover the second mortgage my father had taken out to save him. The bank filed the official notice that November. Sloane packed her things and moved out 2 weeks before the sheriff's sale. She even took the cheap cabinet she had installed over my grandfather's wood originals, leaving only the heavy stained glass transom above the front door. Garrett tried to contest the bequest, but Voss shut him down with an 8-page brief on Ohio law. The judge dismissed the motion in 16 days with a single paragraph, ruling the condition clear, lawful, and enforceable. Garrett stopped calling me entirely after that defeat. Carol sent me a simple card at Christmas with no message, just her name signed at the bottom. I did not write back to her, but I did not throw her card in the trash either. Some family debts just take a little longer to fully settle. In January, I took Nora to the river place for the first time since the reading. The sycamores were bare, and the water was high and gray. I used the brass key on the sticking boathouse door, and it turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting. Inside lay my father's fishing rods, a folding chair, a can of hooks, and the smell of cedar. It was the same cedar scent from the Saturday mornings of my childhood, before he decided I was not worth his time. Nora ran to the water to throw rocks while I sat on the wooden steps, sharpening a carpenter's pencil with my pocket knife. On a scrap of wood, I carefully traced the initials, TM to BM, and drew a single, clean line. That was the very first line of a plan for a small workshop I am going to build right here for Nora, so she has a space where her name actually means something. My brother had once sneered, hoping I would enjoy being homeless. But looking out over these 18 acres of unencumbered riverfront land, I knew I was finally home. Worth is not handed to whoever screams the loudest or has the right name. It is measured by what you can carry on your own. My father learned that too late to tell me to my face, but just in time to write it down. If your own family ever told you that you would amount to nothing, go build something only you can carry. Subscribe, leave a comment, and I will see you in the next video.